Hello, my name is Olga, and I'm here today to talk to you about kids, colds, and COVID tests. I am a scientist. I work in the diagnostics field, and I put this presentation together with a dear friend of mine, Joanna. We are both scientists. We are moms with kids who go to school, kids who go to daycare, and we put a lot of effort into finding evidence to help us understand what is the right testing strategy that can keep our children safe and also keep our schools open. So, if you have only one more minute to spend thinking about this topic tonight, here are the key takeaways. When a child has any cold symptoms, we need testing to rule out that they do not have COVID. Even a sniffle or a sore throat or a tummy ache could be the presence of COVID, and we need a test to determine that. Contrary to what you've probably heard, PCR tests are the wrong choice in this circumstance. They are slow, so COVID can spread before we know who is infected, and they are burdensome, so some parents will avoid testing. Rapid antigen tests, in contrast, are the right choice. They are excellent at detecting contagious COVID, and they will do this quickly. Because they are easy to use, they encourage parents to comply with testing rules. So schools and childcare centers should use antigen tests for every symptomatic child to make a decision about whether that child can attend the program. As we know, kids get sick a lot. By some estimates, children will have 6 to 8 colds a year, depending on whether they're home or they're in a school setting. They may even have more. We also know, which we didn't really at the start of the pandemic, that children can get and spread COVID very well, unfortunately. Presently, Delta infections are rising in some parts of the country, and there is clear evidence that children are part of the transmission chain. So unfortunately, we can't be blasé about testing our children for COVID when they exhibit symptoms. So how do we know? Is it a cold or is it COVID? We have been told that when children are symptomatic, PCR tests are the best way to know. And there are clear advantages of lab-run PCR tests. They are highly sensitive to viral presence. The analysis is standardized, and the results are documented, easy to share with stakeholders. However, PCR tests have several key problems, which we argue make them actually poorly suited for solving the specific problem of a symptomatic child in whom we need to rule out COVID. And the first problem is slow turnaround. I think we've all experienced, those of us who have had testing, we've experienced kind of the delay in waiting for the result. Now, let's say my child has actually contracted COVID last weekend. On Monday, my child is pre-symptomatic and not yet contagious. I'm going to send him to group care or school, whatever that may be in your case. On Tuesday, my child is still pre-symptomatic. At this point, however, he is contagious. And we know that children, like adults, can spread COVID for multiple days before their symptoms develop. On Wednesday, he's still pre-symptomatic and contagious, again, consistent with what's been observed. On Thursday, he's symptomatic. I do the right thing. I keep him home. I get a test as soon as I can. Factoring in appointment times and wait times for the actual test, it can be multiple days before we have results, as many as 5 days in some cases. And so, let's say best case scenario, it's Saturday by the time we've confirmed that it's COVID and we can notify contacts. That means my child has spent several days happily spreading COVID within his classroom. And it takes us a number of days to even let those people know. Slow PCR tests prevent finding other infected individuals, or at least exposed individuals who may unfortunately already be contagious. Now let's say my child is symptomatic, but it's actually a common cold. It's not COVID. Statistically, we should expect a child to have 6 to 8 colds per year that aren't going to be COVID. It's going to take us 2 to 5 days to rule out COVID and get a negative PCR result. That's 12 to 40 days at home. That's up to 8 weeks of education my 9-year-old could lose waiting for results. Now, that's up to 8 weeks of work that I may have to forfeit if it's my youngest child who needs to be home because he needs my attention all the time. Slow PCR tests can cost families weeks of lost school and work time, and it doesn't have to be that way. The second problem with PCR tests is that not all parents are going to comply with testing. Joanna and I put together a survey on parents' compliance with testing rules. You have the survey link in this presentation, so you could read it for yourself. We requested data through our networks on LinkedIn, Nextdoor, a parent listserv that I belong to at Stanford, our Facebook circles, and word of mouth. We got 173 responses as of the date when we analyzed the results. And the respondents were primarily from California or the Mid-Atlantic region. In general, most respondents had children who attend a private childcare center or a public TK-12 program. Most respondents are parents of young children, ages 0 to 5 years. And importantly, one of the first things we learned was that over 10% of parents don't understand or are not aware of their school's testing policies. When we asked, does your child's school or daycare center require COVID testing to attend if the child has mild cold symptoms, 11% of respondents told us they weren't sure. One of the first things we learned also is that if schools require testing, parents are more likely to test their symptomatic child. This seems common sense, but it was interesting to see it, useful to see it come out in the data. So if schools require testing, we asked parents, have you ever sent a child to their school or childcare center with mild cold symptoms without prior COVID testing? When the school requires testing, the vast majority of parents told us they always test. When schools do not require testing, the majority of parents actually send their child to school without carrying out testing for mild cold symptoms. Now, the most kind of important set of parents to understand are those parents who report willingly violating the testing policy at their school and sending their child to school without testing. We posed a hypothetical question to better understand parents' willingness to comply or not comply with policies. We asked the following. Imagine that tomorrow your child wakes up with a stuffy nose. He or she has a good breakfast, is in a normal mood, and claims to be eager to go to school or daycare. Your school's policy requires that your child be kept at home until a lab-based PCR test result is negative for COVID, and the expected wait time for this is anywhere between 24 to 72 hours. How likely are you to report to the school that your child has symptoms and to keep your child home until there is a negative result? We gave parents a 1 to 5 point scale along which to respond, where 5 is absolute compliance with the policy and keeping the child home before the test result comes in. And 1 is absolute certainty that they will not comply and in fact refuse to carry out PCR testing under these circumstances. We learned that the majority of parents will absolutely test or are at least strongly inclined to test their child, which is great. But we also learned that up to 33% of parents told us that they would be willing or at least would consider violating the testing policy. And interestingly, parents volunteered some thoughts about this situation in the using the free response text option that we provided. What we learned is that some parents would use their own judgment for these on-the-spot decisions about mild cold symptoms. For example, one parent told us, if it's just a stuffy nose without any other symptoms, I'm likely to send them. If it was a stuffy nose plus some other symptom, then I would keep them home and get tested. On the whole, this is not good. Testing hesitancy will spread COVID. And as I said earlier, when it's just a mild symptom, it could still be COVID. And we really can't rule that out using our common sense. You may be wondering, Olga, how do we know that the problem is actually PCR tests as opposed to having to test at all? Well, we asked these parents, how can schools and childcare centers encourage testing in this hypothetical scenario that we outlined? Which option would make you more likely to have your child tested? And parents said that any of the following would move the needle for them. Having the school accept results of a rapid at-home test, rapid testing on site at school drop-off, and access to a highly accurate test that provided results within 2 hours were responses that the majority of parents gave as being relevant in making them more likely to comply. So parents told us they would test more if results were fast and tests were accessible. And PCR tests are neither of these things, unfortunately. Now, with respect to on-site rapid testing, we actually have evidence not just of what people would do, but actually what they do. If the school requires testing and also provides on-site testing, we did not record any instances of parents violating a testing policy. In essence, if you make it easy for parents to test their child, they will do it. It's the added burden of making the appointment and waiting for days for results that can be a real barrier for parents. In fact, to avoid these barriers, parents are already using an alternative to PCR tests. Parents told us in the same kind of free response option that they use antigen tests to rule out COVID for children with mild symptoms. In this hypothetical scenario, parents volunteered, some parents, I should say, that they would run a rapid antigen test. And if it was negative, they would send their child to school, despite kind of a clear stated policy that PCR tests were what was necessary. And we wanted to go beyond understanding how parents perceive policies and see how parents would behave when the health of their child was, in fact, at risk, independent of what the rules were of any given institution. So we asked the following question. Let's say your child attended an outdoor party 6 days ago to celebrate John's birthday. Today, you learn that John's grandmother, who lives with John but did not attend the party, has tested positive for COVID. Also, your child wakes up with a cough and a runny nose. What are you likely to do next? The point of this question was to understand if there is some reason to believe your child may have been exposed to COVID, will you trust only a PCR test, or will an antigen test also be acceptable? The majority of parents told us that they would rely on lab-based PCR testing, but 21% of respondents told us that they would be fine with using an antigen test to rule out COVID and get on with their lives. And about 10% of parents told us they would use the watch and wait approach to their child's symptoms before making any decisions about testing. So I think a natural question is, why don't schools and childcare centers use antigen tests? And the answer is that actually many already do. In Delaware, in Ontario, in Israel, and in many other places, rapid antigen tests are a critical part of the school's policies for reducing COVID exposure and spread. Unfortunately, in many places in the US, antigen tests have a perception problem. They're associated with headlines that tell us there's a wrong way to test yourself for COVID. FDA warns that test results may be presumptive. We see that COVID-19 rapid testing in the US is actually lagging behind other countries, particularly Europe, that consider these tests to play a crucial role in combating the pandemic. And here we get to PCR problem number 3, which is a little bit of a complex concept that I'd like to walk you through. But essentially, being PCR positive does not mean you are contagious with COVID. And that has important implications for how we perceive other tests. So the most relevant question, again, when we think about a public health application of these tests is who is contagious with COVID? Who, if they're in a classroom, is going to spread COVID to others and endanger the health and life of more community members? So PCR tests will identify individuals who are contagious because PCR tests are very, very sensitive, and individuals who are contagious happen to have very high viral load, as you can see in this figure, which I have adapted from the work of Michael Minna, who has a lot of excellent communication about the value of different types of tests in COVID. Now, an individual whose viral load is dropping, who is already recovering from COVID, may still be symptomatic in terms of having muscle aches, fever, fatigue, but is nevertheless on the mend. This individual is not contagious, but will still have a positive PCR test. And these are not individuals who the antigen tests are designed to identify. But this is problematic because for the purposes of reducing COVID spread, all of these individuals are essentially false positives by PCR. They are individuals who are labeled as having COVID and perceived as needing to isolate, but are in fact no longer contagious. And I'm not trying to make the argument that these people should be allowed, in community settings, in schools, in libraries. I think a PCR test means you stay home until you've cleared the virus, or at least have cleared it enough. And that's why we have these timeframes in place. But this is kind of the nuance here. When we say that PCR is our gold standard against which we judge all other tests, tests that are designed to only find the contagious individuals are going to appear to perform poorly because we're comparing them to a test that can find all of these individuals, contagious or not. And so this brings us to PCR problem 3.5, the framing of BNext Now. BNext Now is Abbott's antigen test, which was developed for detecting contagious COVID. It's cheap, it's easy to use, and it works. But because it has been evaluated in the context of PCR testing, it's been framed. And there was a study carried out in Arizona in November of 2020, which made a lot of headlines, a lot of negative headlines when it was published in early 2021, that I think seeded a lot of doubt in the mind of physicians, scientists, regulators, and the general public. So let's actually look at this paper. I'm a scientist. I actually work in diagnostic testing, not for COVID, but I have to stare at scientific publications a lot. And what I've learned is the devil, is frequently in the details. So I'm going to pull out kind of the critical pieces of information in this paper. Compared with real-time PCR testing, the BNext Now antigen test has a sensitivity of 64.2% for specimens from symptomatic persons and 35.8% for specimens from asymptomatic persons. That means if you have symptomatic COVID, BNext Now compared to PCR will find 64% of those PCR positive individuals. And for asymptomatic COVID, BNext Now will find 35% of PCR positive individuals, which does not seem good at all. And this is why if you want, you can look up kind of what the press wrote about BNext Now as a result of this paper, and you'll see these two numbers, 60-something percent, 30-something percent quoted in many, many media outlets. But if we read literally 5 more lines down in the same paragraph, what we see is that among specimens with positive viral culture, sensitivity was 92.6% for symptomatic and 78.6% for asymptomatic individuals. What that means is of the people who were also tested using a viral culture, where material was taken from their upper respiratory airways and cultured in a laboratory setting in order to see what material would produce live virus that then goes on to damage other cells. For the individuals that contain live virus, BNAX now will identify over 90% of them compared to what PCR will also identify. So BNAX now, by this same study, is demonstrated to be excellent at identifying people who are shedding live COVID virus, people who are contagious, as opposed to everybody else who is in different portions of the cycle of COVID, but are still going to come up PCR positive. Another way to look at this is to ask, are antigen tests sensitive for people with high viral load? And we can measure viral load in different ways. And in the graph I showed you earlier, higher viral load is what leads to being in the contagious portion of this cycle. Now, kind of anyone who has had scientific training has been taught that we need multiple lines of evidence. So here's another paper that looked at the performance of tests in individuals with higher or lower viral load. These folks over here have the highest viral load, and these folks over here have considerably lower viral load. And people have drawn the contagion line kind of about here. So if I'm not going to get into what cycle threshold means for now, you're welcome to look that up. But essentially, people whose CTs are, somewhere between 25 and 30 or lower are going to be the contagious individuals. And so here we see kind of the agreement between the antigen test and the PCR test. And the key takeaway from this plot is that antigen tests work very well for individuals with high viral load. In other words, antigen tests work very well for individuals who are most likely to be infectious. And if you think about the problem we're trying to solve, which is finding kids who have some symptoms and figuring out, are those kids contagious with COVID, antigen tests prove to be an excellent tool for correctly identifying those individuals. So can negative results with BNAX now be trusted to identify contagious COVID tests? Absolutely. And this is why these tests were developed to begin with. And unfortunately, this is yet another example of the press failing to cover science as accurately as the public needs this information to be covered. I've talked so far about BNAX now, but what about other antigen tests? There are a bunch of them on the market. This is a somewhat complicated plot, but it's actually an excellent plot for showing us everything we need to know to answer this question. So over here, we have different tests. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different antigen tests. The color gradient indicates who is likely to be infectious and who's likely to not be infectious on the basis of viral load, which is indicated here in quantities that increase in order of magnitude. So folks in the orange, but certainly in the light red and dark red, are going to be the COVID contagious individuals, and everyone below is unlikely to be infectious. And here we see sensitivity numbers for all the antigen tests that were evaluated here. And we see that across all the tests, the average sensitivity is 100%. So it doesn't matter what brand of test you're looking at, this technology is excellent at identifying contagious COVID. And here you just have all this information kind of collapsed into one set of numbers for individuals who need to be identified from the perspective of public health. So the answer is antigen tests identify contagious people very well. And this is yet more data that Michael Minna has put out into the world through his Twitter account, where he explains that the data show that rapid tests are excellent public health tools to quickly identify almost anyone who's currently infectious and needs to isolate. It also shows why there's so much damn confusion about whether rapid tests are sensitive. The answer is yes, they are. If the question is, am I infectious now? And do I need to isolate? Or in my case, is my snotty-nosed 2-year-old infectious now? Is it COVID, and do I need to keep him home? Or is it the myriad of other colds he's very likely to pick up in a group care setting? And is it okay to send him back to the classroom? So for public health, again, quoting Michael Minna, we want to identify and isolate only people who are currently infectious. And if someone is currently infectious, we need to know rapidly. We need to know now. We can't wait long enough for someone to get a PCR appointment, get their test results days later, identify contacts who have been exposed, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I've talked about parent compliance. And so here I want to present kind of a toy example of how to put this information together. So let's assume that PCR testing is going to have 70% compliance. So 70% of parents are going to do what they're supposed to do if the rule says any cold symptoms need to be tested with a PCR test. Now, this number 70% is hypothetical, but on the basis of what we saw in our survey, it's a reasonable kind of ballpark. So let's say now that the school your child attends is going to see 100 cases of contagious COVID to the end of the pandemic, whenever that comes. So if we have 100% sensitivity, if PCR tests are perfect, which by the way, they are not, but I'm going to give them the biggest benefit of the doubt I can and say it's perfect at identifying COVID. And we only have 70% compliance, we're going to find 70 of those 100 cases. Now, if the ease and accessibility of rapid antigen tests can move that compliance number from 70% up to 90%, we're actually going to find more instances of COVID cases, even if we allow for a 10% drop in sensitivity. Now, again, this 100% versus 90% number, I don't think is accurate. I think antigen tests do better. And actually PCR tests are not perfect for finding contagious COVID, but let's just say this is what it is. Giving parents a test that they will use and giving parents a test that will give us results now and not 3 days from now is what's going to enable us to identify as much of the contagious COVID as we can in order to keep our children safe, our teachers and our administrators safe, and all the families in our communities as safe as we can. Antigen tests are more useful because they are faster and more popular. So, thank you for sticking with me throughout this whole presentation. If you remember one thing, it's this. What is the best way we can balance COVID risk with the need for our children to be educated, socialized, and the need for parents like me to have, restore the vestiges of sanity, most of which I've lost throughout 2020. And this is how. We have to test every symptomatic child. There can be no exceptions, no doctor's notes because maybe it's allergies. No, sniffly noses are uncommon with COVID. We know none of this is true anymore. Every symptomatic kid needs to be tested. Every symptomatic kid. Now, another thing we're best off doing is surveillance testing of asymptomatic children. And this is not a subject that I have gotten into tonight. But it's also very important. And if you want to learn more about that, I've got a link to some good resources here. Critically, we need to embrace rapid antigen tests as our best tool to quickly identify contagious COVID cases and isolate them from the community and identify their contacts and help those people get tested to understand, who is going to be spreading COVID in the community. What should your school and childcare center do? Hopefully by now it's really clear. I'm going to say it again. Require testing for all symptomatic children. When schools have these policies in place, more parents are going to be testing. Allow rapid test results as proof of negative COVID status. A friend of mine told me the school year just started, her child has already missed 9 days of school waiting for PCR tests. And in every case, it wasn't COVID. She's just one anecdotal example of why it's really important to, give parents a better solution. I think schools should consider providing testing on site for symptomatic children. As a parent, I would pay for this. If my school wants to bill me, I'm more than happy to cover the cost of the test. And from what we've seen in our survey, parents are even more likely to test if this option is available. And finally, schools and childcare centers should make the policies extremely clear. I just spent today helping a friend figure out what the county guidelines are for her school in order to understand what kind of tests are acceptable. And it took us way longer, and we still aren't even entirely sure, frankly, because we found guidelines, but not policies. Policies should be clear, and they should be posted in every classroom, and every parent should understand what to do if their child comes down with cold symptoms. Every parent, there's no reason not to do this. Hopefully, I've presented you with some good information, and hopefully you can now appreciate the utility of rapid antigen testing for symptomatic children. I would love it if you could share this presentation using the link provided. And if folks have questions, they are welcome to contact us through this email, kidscovidtests@gmail.com. I'm really grateful for your attention, and I hope as many people who are able to consider this topic can view this video and get the most out of this presentation. So thanks again, and I wish all of you good health and happy testing.